how effective is EMDR therapy, the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, in comparison to CBT when it comes to panic disorder. I'm really excited to present to you the following therapy study in which CBT, the gold standard of treating panic disorders, was compared with EMDR, the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy. But before we begin, to give you a better idea of EMDR, if you want, you can participate in a little self-experiment, which of course won't be a therapy, but just a little experiment. So if you want, you can take an old anxiety memory in which you really felt a lot of anxiety, not too much. As I said, this is not a therapy. Let's take on a scale from 0 to 10, let's take something like 7 or 8. A memory which, if you think of it today, still makes you feel tense. It still makes you a little bit anxious. So for me, for example, as you know, I was struggling with social anxiety in the past. I would take a moment in which I was still at school and I had to give a presentation in our biology class, which was awful. I was stuttering and I was talking shit. To be honest, it was really bad. And after only 20 seconds, our teacher was saying, "Eskil, you can sit down. This was really bad. This was nothing." And of course, at that time, it felt so bad. And therefore, for several years, when I thought back to this memory, it really made me feel tense again. So if you have a memory like this for yourself, think of it as vivid as possible and then begin to move your eyes. Of course, it should be in a lighted room. It should be, or even better, it should be outside in the nature. But there has to be some visual input for your eyes, and then begin to move your eyes from one side to the other and do this quite fast to give you really a lot of visual input. And the idea is that this visual input interferes with your old anxiety memory. And because we know from memory reconsolidation research that whenever you remember an old memory, it enters an unstable state in which it can be changed. Therefore, this new and unusual visual input really can interfere with your old anxiety memory. And if you want, you can participate in a second, maybe even more strange self-experiment in which you again take a memory. You can take the same memory if you want, but take an anxiety memory, and while you see it in front of your mental eye, listen to the following sounds. And of course, in order to get the best effect, it is recommended to use headphones. So while you see your memory, your old anxiety memory, listen to these alternating tones, which move from one ear to the other ear and back again. I will leave you alone with these sounds for a moment. If you finished, you may take a deep sigh. And relax, just let go for a moment. And if you now think back to your anxiety memory, maybe you will realize that now your anxiety memory is no longer that vivid, it's no longer that strong, and therefore less intimidating. In fact, maybe now you can remember the situation and feel much more relaxed. And of course, now you might say, well, this might be a complete placebo effect. Maybe this is all bullshit. And therefore, it's very interesting to take a look at the actual research, to take a look at randomized controlled studies like the study I want to discuss with you today, but also to take a look at past studies. And actually, there have been quite a lot up to this point And especially for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, for people who had traumatic war experiences, who experienced a life-threatening traffic accident, or who experienced abuse. For people with post-traumatic stress disorder, these meta-analyses could show that EMDR is actually very effective. It's a first-line treatment right next to CBT, and in fact, in some of the meta-analyses, it could be shown that it may be even more effective than CBT in treating post-traumatic stress disorder. But today's study is really special because it's the first really well done study, and therefore it's also highly published in a very important journal, in the journal Frontiers of Psychology. It's the first very well done randomized controlled study in which EMDR was used in comparison to CBT to treat people with panic disorder. And the big question was, is EMDR inferior to CBT when treating people with panic disorder, or maybe it's even more effective? And therefore the scientists randomized 84 participants to either EMDR or standard CBT therapy based on the manual of Krusky and Barlow. Both groups received 1 hour of therapy for 13 weeks. And in the gold standard CBT therapy, in which usually 40 up to 90% of people are in remission after therapy, the participants first received psychoeducation, which meant that they were informed about the pathogenesis of panic disorder. They were informed that the misinterpretation of body sensations plays a very important role. For example, if you realize that your heart is beating faster, and then you have the misinterpretation that this might be a sign that something is wrong with your heart. And this misinterpretation again leads to a higher heart rate, and therefore you have this spiral of misinterpretation and therefore again elevated bodily sensations. But in CBT, they were also taught relaxation strategies. So for example, progressive muscle relaxation in order to be able to relax much more in everyday life. Another very important therapy module was interoceptive exposure, which means that you are exposed to your body sensations, for example, to an elevated heart rate, and therefore you might have to run on one and the same spot, or you might have to climb some stairs, and afterwards you realize, okay, now my heart rate is going up. And in the therapy you will realize, well, okay, my heart rate is going up now, but actually nothing really happens. I'm quite safe. Actually, after a while, the heart rate is going down again and everything is fine again. Another kind of interoceptive exposure might be to evoke some dizziness, and therefore you might have to sit on a swivel chair and you would spin around for some times after you feel a little bit dizzy. A body sensation that can occur during a panic attack as well, and that can be misinterpreted. But here again in the therapy you learn, well, even if I feel dizzy, even if my heart is going faster, even if I have palpitations, and even if I feel that I might lose consciousness, this won't happen. In fact, after a while, habituation kicks in and you get used to these body sensations. And in fact, in order to lose consciousness, and this is something that many people with panic disorder get wrong very often as well, in order to lose consciousness, your heart actually has to be very slow. And this is quite the opposite of what is happening during a panic attack. Because during a panic attack, your heart is very fast, which is not dangerous at all for a short time. Because if you do intense sports, your heart rate will go up as well. And actually, this is quite a good training for your heart. But if your heart rate is so high, I can reassure you, you won't lose your consciousness. You lose consciousness if your heart rate is too low. So those were some things that were learned in this interoceptive exposure. One of the next steps was more cognitive. It was about challenging the automatic thoughts that people have and to reframe them whenever possible. And the last step was the so-called in vivo exposure, in which the patients had to face situations in which they usually experienced panic attacks, for example, in the supermarket or in the bus or in a public place. And there they realized again, okay, I can stand the situation, I can stay in the situation, and if I don't escape the situation, actually after a while, my extreme body sensations calm down and habituation kicks in. So these were the elements of the cognitive behavioral therapy. In the EMDR therapy, a quite different approach was used because based on the positive research results with post-traumatic stress disorder, the patients were asked to remember situations and associated memories of their strongest panic attacks. And while they kept these memories in front of their mental eyes, just like we did in the beginning of this episode, they were listening to alternating sounds. So sounds that were wandering from one ear to the other and back again. And the idea, of course, was to get these panic memories in this unstable state in which the audio signals could interfere with them, and therefore they could be consolidated in a different and less threatening way. And this was repeated in all the therapy sessions again and again until the client said, well, the memory is no longer distressing. And finally, they were also asked by the therapist, and now I quote from the study, to formulate a positive belief regarding the target image. So for example, I guess if somebody had an image of a panic attack in a mall, now after it no longer felt distressing, maybe he now could formulate, well, actually nothing bad really happened, and actually I was quite safe in this moment. So these were the two really quite different therapy approaches. Surprisingly, EMDR, when it came, for example, to agoraphobic cognitions or body sensations, EMDR was not only not worse than CBT, there actually was a tendency that EMDR was more effective than the gold standard therapy, CBT. And this is really remarkable because there are so many people out there struggling from panic disorder or panic attacks every day. And it is very promising to have EMDR as an alternative treatment or maybe even more effective treatment for all these people. And from my perspective, what is very interesting that the scientists themselves say, and this is something that I wondered as well, why did they use these alternating sounds in this study? Why didn't they use the traditional eye movements? And if you read the study, there even seems to be a little bit regret on the side of the scientists because they say maybe the eye movements could have been even more effective. And indeed, there is some basic research, some laboratory studies which speak for that. But of course, for the moment, we still have to wait for more clinical research in this area. Nevertheless, I think this study and all the other studies, especially about post-traumatic stress disorder, show us the potential of memory reconsolidation for therapy. It's absolutely fascinating to know that old memories can be put into this unstable state in which they can be changed and in which other stimuli can interfere with them, for example, sounds, for example, visual input, like the eye movements. In another study, for example, people who had experienced a motorcycle accident played Tetris right after the accident and later on really had less intrusive memories, probably because this visual input interfered with the traumatic experience of their accident. So it really seems like that memory reconsolidation empowers us to conduct quite simple, playing Tetris or moving your eyes or listening to alternating sounds is really simple, quite fast therapies, especially compared to, for example, psychoanalysis, and especially quite acceptable treatments, because it's no wonder that treatment fidelity is quite high if you don't have to conduct that many exposures, and instead you just have to listen to alternating sounds, for example. I really hope you found this episode helpful. Feel free to take a look into the book, and if you want, we will see you next time.